Okay, we're live. Hi, everybody. We're doing okay, I am on camera. This week we're talking about the 2020, the second round of 2020 presidential debates, which happened last week. I'm Alex Howlett. This is Boston Basic Income. And we have some clips from the debate, and we're just gonna get started by looking at some clips. Last time we didn't really get into Andrew Yang very much at the end, until the end. So we're gonna have a few Andrew Yang clips here. So let me pull up the first one here from my notes. I've actually downloaded the video clips this time, so if YouTube flakes out, then
Nice.
we're not gonna have a problem, except for the people watching on YouTube, you're gonna have a problem.
I believe he got more
So
speaking time
yeah.
this time.
2, 3,
Yeah.
and then I looked up the shortcut to go to a specific time in the video, and we're going to 21, 27, unmute, go.
Yeah.
It's frozen.
The other person.
There we go.
The important number in Vice President Biden's remarks just now was that the United States is only 15% of global emissions. We like to act as if we're 100%, but the truth is, even if we were to curb our emissions dramatically, the Earth is still going to get warmer. And we can see it around us this summer. The last 4 years have been the 4 warmest years in recorded history. This is going to be a tough truth, but we are too late. We are 10 years too late. We need to do everything we can to start moving the climate in the right direction, but we also need to start moving our people to higher ground. And the best way to do that is to put economic resources into your hands so you can protect yourself and your families.
Yeah, that was controversial.
That was Andrew Yang's most controversial clip there. So anyone want to raise their hands, have any thoughts? So I'll start. So I think, a lot of people interpreted this as just throw money at everyone and they'll kind of fend for themselves. And I think about it a little bit differently because I think, when people are struggling and they're facing scarcity and desperation, they're less able to kind of come together and work together and respond to crises. So I think humanity is kind of a very powerful organism, but it's sick. And part of the reason that it's sick is because people don't have adequate money. They don't have, they could have a lot more money in their hands, and they could be a lot healthier, and then we can respond to the kinds of shocks that you see with something like climate change. So that's one of the biggest criticisms that he got. But I think, they say like giving people money and having them fend for themselves is not an adaptation strategy to climate change, is what they said. There's what some people's criticism was. And I would say that it's actually a very strong adaptation strategy. And it's something I've been talking about with Basic Income for a while. We had one of these discussions on climate, and this is one of the main things I talked about. Climate disasters disproportionately affect the poor. If nobody's poor, then we can adapt. And that's not to say that climate change is good and we shouldn't be responding to it, which we should. And I actually wasn't a fan of Andrew Yang's tone here when he says, we only do 15% of emissions or whatever. I think, we have an opportunity to lead. We have an opportunity to have a proper climate response. And it's not like we can just do nothing. So there's a lot we can be doing to both respond to climate change and to adapt to it. And I think one of the best ways we can adapt to it is through something like a basic income. But it also, Andrew Yang sometimes talks about taking the boot off people's throat, the economic boot off people's throat. And I think if you do that too, not only does it help us adapt better, but it gives us more bandwidth to think about how to respond. People are responding only to their immediate needs. They're not thinking about how to address climate change and how to come together on addressing climate change. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that. Bethany.
Yeah, I guess I had some similar thoughts. I mean, I think that maybe I agree with you that he could have emphasized the important things that we could do to try to prevent things from getting worse, like the other candidates did. But I also like that he brought up the point, and I'd have to study the scientific literature myself more, but I think it is true that like some changes are coming that are going to be challenging no matter what, and it is too late to have that not happen. And so it is worth thinking about how to address that in the best possible way. And just to add on to what you're saying, like a well-functioning, globalized economy where people all over the world, you know, ideally had money, would go a long way. Because let's imagine you can't grow crops in certain areas anymore. If those people don't have any money to buy food from other areas, if they're subsistence farming, they're all going to starve, right? But if they can, just as an example of what you're talking about in terms of adapting, but if they can buy food from other places, it's a totally different thing. Or if you can, you know, figure out how to
buy seeds that are hybridized or genetically altered. Or
there's just many different options that people do have when they have money.
Yeah, and it's, you know, people are worried about it being a fend for yourself thing, but really if you have the resources to take care of yourself, that allows you to cooperate more. It allows you to work.
Yeah, it's both. But I also think you need both. Like, you need people to have individual resources ideally and some government action.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with everything Bethany said. And I was disappointed about the fend for yourself tone, and the idea that he went right to there's nothing we can do about it. And that sort of implied that we shouldn't be trying. But I mean, it's a format where you can't really talk in depth, but even just what you're talking about in terms of the food and how there's no detail. It's all, that's another reason why people feel, oh, it's just a fend for yourself thing, you know, $1,000. What do we do with that? There's a flood, now what are we gonna do? Even if we have $1,000, how does that relate? He didn't really relate that very well, I didn't think.
Right. I think some people are imagining it like, you know, everybody gets a bucket of water, you know, to put out a fire on their own house or something like that.
Right.
And that's useless, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Ian.
Hey.
But yeah, if you take the same amount of water and you pool it together, now you can put out a fire in someone's house if you pool the resources together. So it feels, I think, to some people like you're taking. A lot of people think that money is the scarce thing too. So you're giving people money. That means you're not, you know, putting money into these other things. So it's like, what are we doing with this money? We're just throwing it at people and saying, fend for yourselves or something like that.
Yeah, and I wish there was more emphasis on the community aspect of responding to a crisis like this. And it wasn't really. It was more of a, you take your money and you do with it as you please, and that's it.
I mean, I think that's kind of the tone, and that's kind of how it came across.
It did. And that's the after analysis.
Right. But when we think about basic income here, we think about these other things. We think about,
right. But he doesn't have the opportunity to really get into that detail, I guess.
He could have done it better. Yeah. So yeah, that was the first clip. Anyone have any thoughts before we move? Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, I think I've heard him respond to that question in a much better way previously.
Yeah.
Which was, like you were saying, about along the lines of, like, if you have time to think about it, you know, if you're not completely always fending for yourself or feeling you have to do everything to make money, then you have time to consider these things. And that to me would have been a smart way to lead in on that question and maybe not emphasize that, we can't do anything about it, because that's a bit of a downer for a debate. But I mean, he does sort of take the dark turn. I think, like, that's his kind of brand a bit. You know, you have that book, what's the war on normal people?
Yeah.
You know, it's not exactly a uplifting. It's funny because it's like its public persona is kind of seems like a kind of
amiable,
very amiable, chatty sort of guy.
Yeah.
He's sort of like he sounds kind of like it's like this. The world is doomed.
Yeah. And actually, you know, I've been a little bit bothered that he hasn't emphasized the fact that basic income can help us adapt to, you know, climate change. And I was glad that he did. I just wish he would have used a different tone.
Yeah.
So I think it is an important part, like, you know, getting the boot off people's throats, allowing people to think about it more. That's what he usually talks about, and that's fine. But here I think he got to another very important part, which is that basic income actually helps us move forward given what's already happening. Go ahead, Neil.
So am I to understand, like, basically, like, the same reason this helps against efforts against climate change is the same reason it, like, promotes what are currently evaluated as vocations that aren't valued by society, because he, like, gives the talking points about, like, how, like, caretakers are going to be valued by society if, like, basic income comes in. So does that mean efforts to fight climate change that aren't corporate driven? Is that what is there? It's
I think it's
force?
more like when you think about the Haiti earthquake and all the suffering that happened there,
Yeah.
you know, if the same earthquake happened in San Francisco, you know, hardly anyone would have died, hardly anyone would have suffered or anything like that.
Yeah.
You know, the reason that that happened and that it was so severe for those people was because of poverty, right?
Yeah.
So if you eliminate poverty, then you have the resources to adapt.
Right.
So I think it's less about measuring, you know, people's value in different ways or contributing to things that people wouldn't normally think of as work. It's more like just straight up, you're giving people money and now they can do stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also especially an international issue, which of course, as president of the United States, he may or may not be affecting this internationally. But
Right.
it's also kind of wealth at the level of the country, and sort of good government and infrastructure at the level of the country makes a huge difference too.
Yes.
But I think that does relate to the money that people personally have because of things you mentioned. They can like pay more attention to politics, pay more attention to advocating for themselves. They can also move more easily.
Yeah.
Even move countries more easily. All of that.
Yeah.
But he could have said, we'll go back into the Paris Accord. I mean,
Right.
He does say that.
he didn't say it then, but he could have.
Probably should have said it then. It's yeah.
Just this whole idea of running to higher ground.
Well, it's a little more complicated because the timetables are going to be different now that we've kind of left. Like
Right.
like it has to
Yeah.
be kind of renegotiated
Right.
and that kind of
But
thing.
still,
But yeah, I mean, I think you're right.
it's a more political stand he
and-
could have taken.
Yeah, and I think Bethany is right that it is an international thing in terms of our response to climate change.
Yeah.
And the United States is like a world leader.
Right.
So we can have a pretty big effect internationally. And something that's frustrated me about Yang is that he does not emphasize that. He always emphasizes, oh, we're only 15%. And I would like to hear that. I would like that to be followed by, we're only 15%, but we have so much influence that we can influence the other 85% or something. Because we do.
Emissions, is that what?
Of global emissions we generate, yeah. You guys ready for another clip? All right.
Delaney, I'll start with you. You say the Green New Deal is about as realistic as Trump saying Mexico is going to pay for the wall. But scientists say we need essentially to eliminate fossil fuel pollution by 2050 to avoid the most catastrophic consequences. Why isn't this sweeping plan to fight the climate crisis realistic?
Well, first of all, because it ties its progress to other things that are completely unrelated to climate, like universal health care, guaranteed government jobs, and universal basic income. So that only makes it harder to do. My plan, which gets us to net zero by 2050, which we absolutely have to do for our kids and our grandkids, will get us there. I put a price on carbon, take all the money, give it back to the American people in a dividend. That was introduced by me on a bipartisan basis. It's the only significant bipartisan climate bill in the Congress. I'm going to increase the Department of Energy research budget by 5-fold because we fundamentally have to innovate our way out of this problem. I'm going to create a market for something called direct air capture, which are machines that actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. Because I don't think we'll get to net zero by 2050 unless we have those things. I'm going to increase investment in renewables, and I'm going to create something called the Climate Corps. That is a plan that's realistic. It's a bet on the U.S. private innovation economy and creates the incentives to get us to net zero by 2050.
So yeah, yeah, go ahead, Bethany.
I thought this was great. I was like, thank God. For a couple of reasons. I mean,
Yeah.
there are other things that I think would also be good, but one thing I liked, which of course you're going to say, is like separating out different goals can often be helpful in terms of meeting them. But also in terms of influencing the other 85%, things like technological innovations or making green energy cheaper or finding ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere, those are things that you can more easily influence as one country, because you can, you know, if it's cheaper here, it'll be cheaper other places, and then other countries will adopt those kinds of solutions. And carbon tax has always made sense to me, like at least in terms of my understanding of economics, because it makes everybody's individual decision making suddenly aligned with the real sort of the sort of public goods problem or the incentive for the cost to humanity of having the emissions, which right now are not put into the financial cost. So it's just hard for people to make those decisions well.
Yeah. I think that's right. He does criticize, like, you're combining two things that don't go together. It's interesting that he criticizes UBI as part of that.
But then he says a dividend.
Right. So that's the other thing. He says a carbon tax and dividend. So Bethany, you're talking about how great carbon tax is, but now he's making it a dividend.
Well, hold
so
on.
now he's combining two things, right?
But I assumed the
Yeah.
following with that, which I thought made some sense.
Yeah.
I imagine one concern people have about carbon taxes and similar things like gas taxes they've tried to do in Europe is
Right.
that like people who can't really afford it end up paying a higher cost for necessities.
Right.
And that's not what you want to do. But it seems reasonable to me that if you add a carbon tax and then you supplement those people's incomes, but still make it more expensive relative for them to use something that has carbon versus not something that has carbon, you're still influencing decisions in the right direction. You're just making poorer people richer overall, but you're still disincentivizing carbon relative to other choices, things that emit carbon relative to other choices. That seems like a
Right.
reasonable balancing point if you're concerned about like the impacts on poorer people.
Right. So I guess in a way he's doing the carbon tax to get the right incentives for emissions, and then he's giving people, so he's kind of like doing a basic income and doing this tax, and he's using one as an excuse for the other almost.
Yeah.
Neil.
So it's a two-part. The one question,
Yeah.
because I've been to the discussion before, I assume by the fact that you're highlighting that it's a carbon tax dividend, that's a form of income in a sense, or is that what you're alluding to?
So the
Or-
dividend part is the income. The carbon tax is you're just punishing people for you're charging them a fee for emissions.
And
Yeah.
B, and this is probably also something you talked about before, I don't know how in this platform, basic income is gonna get any further in the public's mind if they just think of it as like a tax rebate, as
Right.
opposed to what it actually is. And he did it just by putting it in the same thing as the Medicare for all and everything like that, so like.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So when he was specifically referencing UBI, not when he was
Yeah.
talking about his carbon tax and dividend. Yeah, I mean, I think there is this sense among people that the government has a certain amount of money and what's the best way to spend it. And that's kind of like not how we always think about it here. So if you're doing a basic income and that means you can't do other things, then it gets a lot more complicated to try to think about whether it's a good idea, that kind of thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Why are those things put together? Is it part of the Green New Deal that all, okay. So it's really
Yeah.
UBI
legislative.
isn't though, I don't think.
I didn't think
So,
either.
so
UBI just said universal health.
he said
No, he
universal
said
basic
UBI
income.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Green New Deal is not a specific policy.
Right.
It's like a wish list type
It's
thing.
an umbrella thing for a bunch of.
Right.
Yeah.
And at one point, one version of it had basic income mentioned in it,
Yeah.
but it didn't,
But I don't
elaborate
think
any
that's the
further than
ones
that.
that are being most talked about.
No, it's mostly the jobs guarantee, creating
Yeah.
green jobs, that
Right.
kind of thing. Yeah.
That seemed a bit disingenuous to throw in
Honestly,
UBI there in Delaney's response.
I think he threw it in because he wanted to make it sound even worse.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah,
I
Bethany.
guess one more thing we talk about a lot in here that he didn't mention, which would have been interesting, is that it actually can add to emissions or add to waste of resources to have unnecessary jobs. So you're kind of like, if you're guaranteeing people a job in helping to
Yes.
fight climate change, it still might net be really good for the efforts, but you are kind of working against yourself
Right.
a little bit.
And this is actually another way in which basic income helps us respond directly to climate change and reduce emissions, because it allows us to eliminate unnecessary jobs, unnecessary waste of resources in the economy, because we've created so many jobs just as a way of pushing incomes to consumers. Yeah, go ahead.
What is he talking about, taking the carbon out of the air? Is there something that exists, or is that
Oh,
a
yes,
fancy?
yes,
Yeah, go ahead,
yeah, you can actually, yes, sequestration, you can pump it underground, but if there's like a earthquake or something, you can just fly out of it.
Oh, so is it a machine, or what is it?
So it's a pump, and then there's all, how there's oil wells?
Yeah.
Where the oil used to be, there's all these like gaps and thing, chambers, so you can pump it down into the chambers. And there's also like another version where you can put these fan type things on top of buildings, and it traps it in these like foam, type stuff.
Like yeah.
Never heard of that.
So yeah, I mean, there's various kind of technologies that are being worked on to try to pull carbon out of the atmosphere,
Right.
filter it out of the atmosphere. Yeah.
Andrew Yang sometimes mentions geoengineering and these kinds of things
Right.
too. He didn't mention it here, but when he talks about things being too late, sometimes he talks about that.
He's talked about launching a bunch of satellites into orbit to block the sun,
What?
to like reduce reduce like 30% of the sun's rays or something like that to help with climate change. Andrew Yang has said that.
I didn't hear that specifically, but
That's
he.
not my most favorite part of this plan. Geoengineering, I'm like very nervous about
The
it.
giant car fire.
Yeah.
Yeah. or satellites with like mirrors on them that reflect.
Freakonomics talked about something simpler. It had to do with the effect that like volcanic eruptions are often cooling, and you could put like certain, I think it was sulfur or something. You could put certain materials more into the atmosphere.
Yeah, you
Into the
can
volcano?
use into the atmosphere.
The same kinds of materials you could put into the atmosphere.
So the volcanoes eject a bunch of stuff into the atmosphere. We could do that if we wanted to. We could be our own volcano.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is the proposal, like aerosols and stuff like that, just like putting particles in the atmosphere to block the sunlight and cool the air. Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Could you quickly describe those sort of unnecessary jobs, describe that would reduce climate change?
Yeah, so to the extent that we're creating jobs for the benefit, look at that book. To the extent that we are creating jobs for the benefit of the worker, Neil, we're not creating them because there's actually work that needs doing.
It's for the benefit of that person having an income.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So we have all kinds of economic policies and stuff that are designed to get the economy to full employment, reduce unemployment, create jobs, that kind of thing. Politicians talk about creating jobs. And when we have like infrastructure projects and everything, I actually have that book at home, so you can borrow it if you want. Yeah, there it is, bullshit jobs. His notion of bullshit jobs is a little bit different than mine. He's talking about jobs where you feel like you're not doing anything useful. I'm talking about jobs that wouldn't exist if we were only producing the stuff that the economy actually needed.
So a lot of overlap between them.
There's a lot of overlap. So the idea is that if you eliminate these unnecessary jobs, like we don't need the output of these jobs, now you don't have people commuting to work every day to the extent that we're eliminating the jobs, and there's other resources that are obviously used in industry and stuff like that, and that can be good for
You're
the
not like
environment.
heating their office.
Right.
You're not using raw materials.
Yeah,
Alex.
so to me, that's the biggest thing that would make a difference for climate change.
Yeah.
Would be the amount of commuting that people do on a regular,
Yeah,
regular
it's so
basis
much.
that would-
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like that would be,
Yeah.
that'd be huge.
And we posit that basic income is a strong force against current commuter habits,
Well, it's a strong force about current job creation.
job creation.
Yeah.
Which is directly, I
So
think, within
Yeah, that makes sense.
I usually advocate I talk about calibrating basic income to the full amount that the economy can handle. So another way of putting that is getting basic income to a high enough level that all of the unnecessary jobs are eliminated. So it's not just about like paying for people's basic needs or something like that. It's about allowing the economy to be more efficient, also in terms of resource usage, but in terms of everything. Yeah. You guys ready for another clip?
Let's do it.
All right.
hit us up.
Unmute, then full screen.
Delaney.
So climate crisis is the existential crisis for our world. It puts every living thing on this planet at risk. I have a plan for a green industrial policy that takes advantage of the fact that we do what we do best, and that is innovate and create. So I've proposed putting $2 trillion in, so we do the research. We then say anyone in the world can use it, so long as you build it right here in America. That will produce about 1.2 million manufacturing jobs right here in Michigan, right here in Ohio, right here in the industrial Midwest. And the second thing we will do is we will then sell those products all around the world. Right now, for every $1 the United States spends trying to market around the world, China is spending $100.
Thank you, Senator.
Yeah. Bethany.
Well, I liked the idea of putting money into innovation.
Yes.
I think that again, like with other people saying, it makes a lot of sense. I think with climate change being so important, one part of me would say, like, why would you try to hinder anybody using it in any way by making them do it here?
Yes.
But I understand that there's also political constraints, which of course my opinions rarely have anything to do with. So like, it's possible that would make it easier to actually get it passed through the real political system. But in terms of what would be kind of my ideal, you would try to get people to use it as much as possible because there's such an impact on everybody.
Yeah. I think in order to do what's ideal for the climate, you need to separate industrial policy from climate policy. So we want to create green infrastructure. We want innovation for green technologies and stuff like that. We want to do that using the minimum amount of labor possible. Otherwise, we're just wasting people's time and potentially creating inefficiencies. Like if people have to buy it from us, that means they can't develop it on their own, that kind of thing.
And we have to ship it abroad.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, I think I think that's probably not too huge of a deal. Like they could license with us and manufacture. I don't know. I don't know what she's thinking in terms of the specifics, in terms of the details. All I know is that she's talking about climate innovation, which is great, but then she's introducing inefficiencies into her plan for the sake of jobs, for the sake of American jobs, and that's a mistake. Yeah. Anyone have any?
So is that an international deal? I mean, how can we restrict what other
Yeah.
countries are developing?
So the idea, you'd set up trade deals with these other countries saying you can use our technology, and then, or you can use our technology if you pay us, and then we'll do something for you in terms of like fair trade or something like that. It would be in part
Or
of trade
maybe
negotiations.
it's like a copyright thing. Like we have like deals with other countries where we enforce each other's copyrights.
Right.
So maybe that's what she has in mind. Like if we develop it and then it's
Yeah.
patented.
She floated this idea by other countries? I mean, how does the world feel about
Yeah,
that?
right.
I know she hasn't floated it by me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question whether you could even negotiate something like this and
Right.
and have it succeed, because other countries probably want to develop climate technology too. And now are you just like, are we in a situation where China has steel workers and we have steel workers and everyone wants their own steel workers to have a job, so they're not allowed, like what kind of restrictions do you
Right.
want to put on trade? What kind of inefficiencies do you want to add there? Yeah,
And I
definitely.
guess just to reiterate, like this is part of why, Ian, it's so frustrating to me, because you don't want to hamper the use of it in any way, or the development in other countries,
Right.
or any of that, yeah. Or the
Right.
sharing of ideas, right? Like what if it's a collaboration between the US and China? Like how does that get counted? But I understand the constraints of trying to actually pass something through Congress. But
Yeah, it gets really complicated once you start to try to enforce this kind of stuff, and it's inefficient in terms of the logistics and working out the agreements, and it's inefficient in terms of resources for the planet too.
Yeah.
So it's disappointing to hear her talk this way, but it's also not surprising because this is how politicians think. They want to create jobs. Yeah.
And like climate change is one of those global issues where it's a lot of what might come back to us might have to do with wars that start in other places, because they're much more harder hit than we are, because they don't have the resources, et cetera. So
Yeah.
it just seems like a case where there's a really strong case to be made for like being as generous internationally as possible.
Yeah.
Which this is.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alex.
I this is kind of, I'm going to keep talking about climate change, but one of the things that never seems to come up or gets very short shrift when it comes to like climate change, and we tend to think about it very much in terms of like, technical fixes for carbon, and just sort of we focus on carbon so much, but then there's so much that needs to be done in like things like wetland restoration and habitat, and protecting the Amazon from deforestation. And I mean,
Right.
carbon policy can affect that so much, only so much, but then there could be a lot of like, that's something that would involve a lot of labor that has to be done.
Yeah.
And we tend to focus on like just the easier fixes.
Right.
I'd like to see that. I feel like that's another area where, I don't know how this would work, but basic income could really help make people start thinking about the natural world that we live in. Because we
Right.
still depend on those systems.
Yeah.
And we tend to think, that's the kind of problem like geoengineering. It's like there's so much stuff we can do with our natural systems that we don't even understand yet, and yet we're gonna like talk about like blocking the sun. It's sort of a bit nuts.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Neil, did you have a thought?
No, actually.
Okay, Richard.
Actually, there already are companies where, like drones, they drop these seed balls that millions of them all over the place, and then these seed balls germinate and sprout all these trees, so you don't have to have people walking around with sacks dropping seeds everywhere like they used to.
Huh, that's cool.
right.
One thing, just this is sort of a side note, but since you prompt, I just watched a TED talk about how de-desertification is actually like massively influential for climate change. Undesertifying, either preventing land from becoming desert or reversing that process. Could have
the
a
Sahara
massive
Desert,
impact.
10,000 years ago actually had hippopotamuses and things like that.
It was a fascinating talk. He'd spent his whole career trying to figure out why lands desertify, and it turned out that it's actually the absence of animals that is doing it, rather than we thought it was the livestock. But you actually need to have like huge roaming herds of animals in a particular way. So anyway, to your point, he had these strategies of how you could get people to herd their animals differently,
Right.
and it does work. I forget the statistics, but it was a shockingly massive effect. And this is one of the things we don't talk about. It's different from carbon emissions.
Yep.
That is on global warming. So.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway.
You guys ready for another clip?
If you've heard anything about me and my campaign, you've heard that someone is running for president who wants to give every American $1,000 a month. I know this may sound like a gimmick, but this is a deeply American idea, from Thomas Paine to Martin Luther King to today. Let me tell you why we need to do it and how we pay for it. Why do we need to do it? We already automated away millions of manufacturing jobs, and chances are your job could be next. If you don't believe me, just ask an auto worker here in Detroit. How do we pay for it? Raise your hand in the crowd if you've seen stores closing where you live. It is not just you. Amazon is closing 30% of America's stores and malls and paying zero in taxes while doing it. We need to do the opposite of much of what we're doing right now, and the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math. So let me share the math. $1,000 a month for every adult would be $461 million every month right here in Detroit alone. The automation of our jobs is the central challenge facing us today. It is why Donald Trump is our president, and any politician not addressing it is failing the American people.
So obviously you guys have heard me talk about this before. So I like to say that automation is not the problem. Automation is calling attention to the fact that jobs have always been the wrong way to get incomes to consumers. So I think it's, it makes sense that, especially with all the technology we have today and, what happened with Donald Trump, that Andrew Yang is using this, and he probably believes this, that the economy is undergoing some kind of fundamental shift. But we have an amazing capacity to make up useless jobs for people as an excuse to give them money with our economic policy. And that's not something that's necessarily going to change. And we even see this talked about on the debate stage when people talk about, the Green New Deal and a jobs guarantee. What is a jobs guarantee? You're promising everyone gets a job, whether we need the output of that labor or not. So I don't think Andrew Yang is right that there's some kind of fundamental shift that's going to happen that basic income is the response to. I think he's right that basic income is the right answer, but I think he's coming at it from a way that a lot of people think about it, and it's resonating with a lot of people, but it's not how I think about it. Yeah, Neil.
Two things. First, a little small note. For some reason, the way he said the word millions seemed very presidential to me. Which is very funny. Secondly, well, I guess that's actually the second part is two things. Firstly, I still don't think he made the good link about we need to do the opposite of what's happening right now, or here's how it fixes the problem. I think he built it up well, and he had to do the framing of automation to adapt to what people are concerned about today. But I still don't think he probably gave a sufficient conclusion here. And secondly, also from something you probably talked about, it's a whole mentality that jobs is part of a meritocracy, that you're paid for what you do. So how does that value, that's quote unquote American value, how do we reframe that this is also an American idea in a sense?
Yeah.
So that's a pretty ingrained thing in human society, right? That you have to pull your weight and earn your keep and contribute, right? So the question is, if we've really adapted to feel like you have to have a job in order to have a meaningful life, that kind of thing, what's the most efficient way to provide people with that meaning? Now, as it turns out, most of the jobs we have in our society are not designed to activate those adaptations that make people feel good about themselves, and the kind of, that's what sports are, right? Sport, you're working hard, competing, and that's kind of what we've adapted to, at least on a biological level and that kind of thing. But most jobs, the typical job in America, people are miserable at their job. So if we were designing jobs for the purpose of providing people with meaning and purpose in their lives, we wouldn't be designing the jobs that we have now. Yeah, Bethany.
I guess I don't know if you were speaking more to in terms of how you would sell the idea that there's kind of a deep meritocratic view that makes it seem kind of wrong to give money to people for nothing. Is that kind of part of what you were getting at?
Right, and it's that frame, that's how people frame it.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
It's the instinctive reaction you get when you tell people that basic income.
Right.
That's almost the first thing they'll say, look, you're giving people money
So
for nothing.
I think one approach that I like to do is this whole pointing out that you didn't earn your job. You didn't earn that money. You have that job for most people in most jobs, at least partly, you have that job because the government decided to create a certain number of jobs through economic policy because it decided the people needed a certain amount of money. This is not like, you didn't get this because you earned it. You got it because the government created a job for you.
I think
Yeah,
there's
go
other
ahead,
holes.
Bethany.
So like the hole that Andrew Yang tends to try to poke in this is the one about, you mentioned before, like people who, we kind of know they're doing something very meritorious, but they're not
Yeah.
getting paid anything. So then you start to think, oh, I guess the economy doesn't really work this way even now. Other examples would be like, you can point out other ways in which people's value that we think they're contributing doesn't really correspond to like the amount of money that they're making, like teachers versus, you know, whatever people think of.
Homemakers,
Yeah,
mothers,
exactly.
and
No,
it brings up-
I'm saying
Yeah.
like, for whatever I
Right.
believe or not, I'm saying like just from like a.
Yeah, and I'm just saying that's how Andrew Yang tries to combat it. For whatever
I
reason.
totally
Yeah.
see that. That makes sense to me.
I don't know if that resonates because it is such a deep idea, but
No, that totally resonates, and I want to follow with you later about the
right.
whole economic policy thing, that everyone's job being from the government.
Yeah.
I need to form
Yeah.
some links there.
I think I agree with you, Alex, but I guess I would say that's only one of the ways in which people are misconstruing how the economy works when they have this meritocratic idea. And the other is like, as we know, you pay people, at least in an efficient market, what you need to get them to do the thing, which doesn't always have that much to do with like it might have a lot to do with the value the thing is producing, but it also
Right.
might have a lot to do with whether people naturally want to do the thing. This is why you don't have to pay parents to parent their own kids. How much there's like a limited supply of people who can do the thing versus, you know, not. There's sort of all different kinds of factors that
Yeah.
affect pay levels that have nothing to do with the value.
Right. Like if there's, so I like to say the labor market is a market for getting people to do things. If someone's doing something already because it's valuable to them and it's also valuable to society, you wouldn't expect that person to get paid because it's what they want to be doing anyway.
Right.
In an efficient labor market, the only purpose of wages is to get someone to do something other than what they'd ordinarily be doing. So, you know, we kind of, in our, you know, society and in our laws, we kind of draw this line between what's a job and what's not. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can just be people are out there living their lives, and then certain people are being paid a certain amount to do something different to some degree, and that's the labor market, right? And in our society, we tend to expect three things out of the labor market: efficient allocation of the resource of labor, then incomes for consumers, and then, you know, as Neil pointed out, meaning and purpose for workers. So a question we can ask is, to what extent do we want to sacrifice, number one, efficient allocation of labor for these other two things? And I would say that in an ideal world, we wouldn't want to do it at all. Basic income can take care of number two if we calibrate it to the maximum. And then for number three, you know, we might want to put resources into creating meaningful and purposeful activities for people, but we probably wouldn't want to frame that as jobs. We'd probably want to think about it as something else and not really part of the labor market. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
So I probably say this every time we talk about the subject, but I think, at least especially in the United States, the reason I think it's hard to dislodge that idea is that so many other things are tied to jobs, like healthcare and all these other things which are not job related really about the thing. And so I think like whenever you hear a politician say jobs, you can sort of like, you know, pencil in all these other things around it, because it's like a proxy for you know, healthcare and all the other good things that, you know, that have historically come with jobs, but don't, and in other countries don't come with jobs. Like, you know, most countries do not have employer-based healthcare, and there's a good reason for that. You know, it's a really stupid way to do healthcare, but
you're tying the labor market to livelihood.
Yeah, well, yes, exactly. It's sort of like one-to-one versus if you can like unbundle it. I keep talking about, I think what was it, unbundling, like, you know, your cable, you know,
Cord cutting.
Yeah, you unbundle, like, I don't want to watch like, you know, 17 channels of the ESPN. I'm not interested, but you know, you pay for it. You know,
A la carte.
Yeah, a la carte.
Yeah. So basic income is income a la carte.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
You guys ready for the next clip?
Yeah.
Okey-doke.
And importantly, we've done this. When people come out of the legal system and they've done their responsibility to the citizens, we need to make sure they get a job. We have banned the box so that people can actually get a job when they come out.
So again, he says job, but when he says job, like Alex said, he means all these other things, like the opportunity to live a healthy, successful, meaningful life, that kind of thing. So does anyone have any comments on that? The next one is actually, the next clip is actually related to this one. Okay, we'll go to the next one.
He's talking about being released from like incarceration.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
the idea is that you don't have to check, or you're not allowed to ask people to check, right? Whether they're
Yeah,
a
so
felon
with,
or not.
so
Yeah.
on many job applications, there's currently a checkbox of like, have you ever been convicted of a felony? So it's
Right.
felony specific.
Right.
And the box is complicated because it's like, it's bad, like having the checkbox is bad because then people who have been convicted of a felony or certain employers tend to be like, oh, well, automatically I'm not gonna consider
Right.
you. But there's been some research that when you get rid of it, that then people essentially use racist proxies. That they're like, oh, if I can't have a box, it tells me which black man is a felon, I will assume all black men are felons.
Yep.
Right.
So it's not.
Oh, so it has these sort of perverse effects.
Yeah.
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 I see.
So it actually protects people.
That's kind of what I was thinking might
Yeah.
happen, yeah. Because, well, I mean, it protects the people who aren't felons.
Right, it prevents
and-
false
Yeah.
false positives.
The name for this in game theory is pooling. So like the people, I'm gonna describe this in a kind of cold way. I don't feel cold towards these people, but like you might say in game theory that the people who are not felons, who are felons, would like to pool with the people who are not felons and be indistinguishable from
Right.
them.
Yeah.
That's good for them,
Yep.
but it's bad for this is just reiterating what you're saying, but it's bad for the people who are not felons because now they can't be distinguished from the people. And that would maybe be okay if it was literally just that was the only information. This was then the whole population was pooled. But of course we have other statistical correlates of being a felon. And so there's a huge incentive for the employer to use those, which is presumably what's happening.
So it ends up being, I assume, like on net, like bad for like black men in general, and then like a slightly better. So like if you're like a white man who's a felon, like it's better for you,
Right.
Because
Right.
like your potential employer can't discriminate against you,
Yep.
like a priori.
Right.
But like if you're a black man, it's just
Right.
bad for you. 'Cause,
Probably if you're a black felon, it's good for you, right? I would guess on average.
Maybe.
would-
I don't know how fine like
Right.
how powerful discrimination
I see,
is
yeah.
against black men.
It's
So
a good
like,
point, right?
like I don't know if it's like okay if we're just like obviously it's not as strong as being like we're not considering anyone with like
Right.
who's black. So I don't know
Yeah.
how it nets.
That's
out.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and it's all jobs, right?
Right.
And it's interesting because, you think about the labor market, really, should we have a problem with employers, they want someone to do something, should we have a problem with them choosing who they want and paying that person? And yeah, we do have a problem with it when we feel that people are entitled to jobs or people are entitled to earn a living and that kind of thing. If we didn't feel that way and we were only concerned with having an efficient labor market, if a business is hiring people in a way that is inefficient for themselves, then we can say, okay, that business is choosing to have a less efficient business, a less optimal business, and that's their problem. But it starts to become society's problem when we place this importance on jobs.
I guess
go
I'll
ahead,
just say
Bethany.
two more things about that,
Yeah.
which are highly related, which is one, like, of course it also affects the general crime rate too, if that's something that you're concerned about. Because if this is the only way to have like healthcare and an income, I imagine people are much more
Right.
likely to have to turn to crime
Yeah.
for a way to survive without any way to get a job. So as a policymaker, you might almost prefer for the person who's a felon to get the job over the person who's not, because the other
Yes.
person might have other resources where they won't go back to, so there's that indication. And then the other thing I wanted to say is like, it also kind of shows that we're not absolutely desperate for the labor, which goes to this point of like, are there sort of even enough things that we need people to do? Because felon or no, if we were desperate for the labor, like more of these jobs would be, there'd be a job for the person. So
I think that's right.
yeah.
And I think if you're living in a society with a basic income, it actually doesn't necessarily benefit society to give all the felons jobs, right? I mean, it benefits us for them to have incomes and not, resort to crime, and for them to have, happy, fulfilling, meaningful lives. But it doesn't necessarily, it's not like we need the labor specifically of felons or convicts. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that I think the introduction of a UBI then would allow that place to still be there for employers to decide whether they'll consider that or not, because at least the felons will have, like, what percent of the population is incarcerated right now? Like, we don't even talk about, we don't even talk about jobs for that percentage of people. We
Right.
talk about the people who are in poverty.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's like, that makes sense that they have something that can. build the
So
life.
that is a great segue to the next clip.
Mr. Yang, your response?
I speak for just about everyone watching when I say I would trust anyone on the stage much more than I would trust our current president on matters of criminal justice. We cannot tear each other down. We have to focus on beating Donald Trump in 2020. I want to share a story that a prison guard, a corrections officer in New Hampshire said to me. He said, we should pay people to stay out of jail because we spend so much when they're behind bars. Right now, we think we're saving money. We just end up spending the money in much more dark and punitive ways. We should put money directly into people's hands, certainly when they come out of prison, but before they go to prison.
Thank you.
So I think that, he's separating out the job thing, right? Like Inslee says, we need to make sure when people come out of prison they have jobs, and Yang is saying when people come out of prison we need to make sure they have money, and I think that's a much more kind of straightforward solution.
And maybe if they had the money, they wouldn't necessarily be in the prison.
Right, exactly.
Exactly.
He's also saying that, which is really important.
Yes.
Yeah, Richard.
And last week tonight they had the whole thing about prison jobs, about how they pay them like 15 cents or less per hour, and how this chain gang sort of thing is still around, and they actually rely on all these people to do the jobs like inside of the prison, so that if you actually had paid them $8 an hour or whatever, then the prison wouldn't be sustainable.
Interesting, right.
And there's other companies that also prop up prison labor that can have really cheap goods because they're only having to pay them. Like, I assume the prisons get some sort of commission, some sort of cut on that, but when you're paying people 15 cents an hour, you can afford a pretty generous cut to the supervisor as an entity to be like, oh great, we can.
Neil?
Like the Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
This could segue into a whole other big discussion, but I'm trying not to do that. But I'm sure you talked about certain test cases of basic income, or whenever the first great experiment happens, among all other statistics that need to be run, to a really important part of whatever the first experiment is to convince people that you got to keep going, and I think crime statistic analysis needs to be part of that experiment. Because one of the biggest things we talk about our prison system is people re-entering the prison system, and that's such a high return rate.
Right.
And hopefully this would reduce that return rate.
So I think that's a good point. I think one of the tricky things about basic income is you can't really test it. Because we kind of do know that if you give people money, they're going to be better off. Most people, when they argue against basic income, it's not giving people money versus not giving people money. It's giving people money versus doing something else. So we know that people are going to be better off if you give them money. The question is it even possible to give everyone that amount of money or a significant amount of money without wrecking the entire economy, or without having to sacrifice other good things that we're doing with our resources, that kind of thing. Yeah, Bethany?
I do think though that we've talked about this before too, but there is some percentage of people who are skeptical, believe it or not, about just giving people money and the benefits that it would have. And if they're going to be skeptical about it for anyone, they're going to be skeptical about it for people who are likely to become criminals, or have already been, or likely to go to jail, I should say, or have already been in prison or something like this.
Yeah.
And so it couldn't hurt to show those kinds of benefits.
There have been pilot studies, I think, and I don't know the details, but there's the Mincome experiment in Canada, and obviously the Finland one that happened. I assume they kept track of some of those things. And I think there were some benefits in that area, but I don't know.
I think they've shown that they are better off, and I think you're right that if you can show some of these benefits by giving people direct cash transfers, that can make your argument stronger. But I think it's important to also understand that even if you run this experiment and it shows that if you give people money, it actually makes them worse off or something like that, basic income is still a good idea. Because a properly functioning market economy requires consumers to have spending money. So the default should be to give everyone money. And then if there's certain people who happen to be using that money in ways that harm themselves, then you address that as kind of its own problem. So that's why I'm a little bit wary of the pilots, because what if they show the opposite effect? And I don't think they will, but if they did, people will take that as an argument against basic income, or as evidence against basic income, when it's really not. Go ahead.
I think most people are focused on the social benefits of basic income. I mean, here we hear you talk about it being you're flipping it so that it's the other way, that it's good for the economy. and that we have spending money that keeps the economy going, but most people are not thinking of it that way. They're thinking of it in human terms, which is the good news and the bad news in terms of it being popular or it having a chance at all. So if there is an experiment that shows that people don't benefit from it, it could be a problem. Yeah, it could be a big problem.
And that's a big part of why I'm wary of
why
these
you don't
experiments.
want it,
Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, like, ultimately the social benefits are driving you too, in the sense that that's why you have the economy, but
Right.
it's a different way of thinking about it.
Right.
Yeah. And I guess also, like, the social effects or the effects on something like crime, they also might need things that are rarely in these experiments. Like, it probably matters a lot whether it's going to continue, that your basic income is going to continue for the rest of your life and can serve as a reliable source of income. And it also matters if, like, your entire community has it or not. Because from the what little bit I know about different situations that tend to push people into these kinds of things, like, it's often a very socially embedded situation where maybe, like, I was just listening to this one podcast where everybody is automatically by default in a gang according to where they live. So even if they had money, like, people are still going to shoot at them or expect them to act in certain ways. They still need to then defend themselves. There's nothing that they can, I mean, they could just move, but the
Right.
whole community having it would make a big difference.
Right. And a lot of times they don't have the resources to move. So this is something I bring up with basic income too.
But a basic income pilot could show that, because then they might just move.
Do they qualify for the pilot if they leave the
but
pilot
again,
area?
but also if they're
Yeah.
not going to have it forever, maybe they can't move.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
that's true.
A pilot could be, if it was the whole, like maybe a small, but a country, one country.
Oh, yeah,
did it-
definitely.
Did it.
Yeah, I
mean,
think.
and I agree that there's obviously going to be people going to be able to say, will always say, oh well, that's not like the United States because of X, Y, and Z. You know,
Right.
You know, there's always going to be a counter argument. I agree, but it doesn't need to mean that. I mean, you can still learn things from those.
Yeah,
those
and
studies.
I think the smallest useful area to test a basic income would be a monetary zone. So
What?
a monetary zone. So
like Macau in China.
so any economy where everybody's using a currency and the economy is associated with the currency. So the United States is a monetary zone, but the European Union, they have the euro across a lot of different countries. So you couldn't have a basic income really just in Greece or something like that. But you could have, a European basic income, or you could have one in England because they have their own currency,
Or Canada,
that kind of thing, or Canada.
Australia.
Yeah. So when I say monetary zone, I just mean the level at which the basic income is being administered is the same level at which the monetary policy is being administered. Yeah. Go ahead.
This might be obvious, but I was just realizing that not only is income linked with a job and a reward, it's also lack of income is linked with a punishment. So giving prisoners who come out of the prison system free money, in some ways, it isn't so much that it's not linked to a job as that they shouldn't be able not to be punished.
Feels like they don't deserve it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's true for a lot of this.
Yeah.
It was like, why should we give people money they didn't earn, that they don't deserve?
Right, and but
Yeah.
we're tying it to jobs, but it's bigger than that. It's also like money is a reward for being good,
So
being
it's-
a good person.
So it can be useful to think about why we think of people as good people, or
Right.
why we reward certain things and punish the certain
Yeah.
things. And that has to do with the incentives, right? So it has to do with ultimately it has to do with what we want out of people, like how we want them to behave and how we want them to participate in society. But those kind of incentives get baked into our morality.
Right.
So even when they don't make sense from an overall incentive in terms of what you want people to be doing anymore, we still kind of punish using our moral judgments and that kind of thing. So it can help, we think, if you didn't work, then you don't get to have any money. We feel like you don't deserve the money. But as it turns out, there's an optimal level of labor that we need to incentivize in the economy. And our morality does not account for that. So it's possible to under-incentivize labor and then not enough people are working, but it's possible to over-incentivize labor, and now you have way more work being done for the actual amount of stuff that's being produced, and that's kind of the useless job thing. So it's a really tricky thing to kind of like get at people's morality. Yeah,
Part
Richard.
of the argument about not giving prisoners money is that crime shouldn't pay, but when there's white collar criminals where crime really does pay, like in the mortgage crisis and things like that. And so it doesn't really apply. It's just there are certain grades that people.
You're just supposed to, when you're coming out of prison, you're supposed to have paid your debt.
Yeah,
Right.
Right. That's the the theory, the kind of justification that's often used is that you paid your debt, but yet, like as you say, like you let fall in this checkbox and stuff clearly indicates you're not.
You haven't paid it yet.
You haven't.
paid it.
Yeah, Neil, go ahead.
This might be a slight tangent, but with regards to like basic income for felons, didn't he also make a tweet sort of clarifying about how it also goes to, I forget if it was also undocumented immigrants basic income, or immigrants or like some form of like not fully citizen income? Or
I think Andrew Yang has said that it's not supposed to go to undocumented immigrants. It only goes to citizens. I wrote a blog post a couple days ago. I don't know if you guys saw it, but it's about how we should have both open borders and a basic income, and anyone who comes here should get a basic income. For free.
I think that's literally right.
Yeah, so that was me.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I just pumped you.
Yeah. So thanks for that. You guys ready for another one here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Everyone, whatever our differences, we know that before we are anything else, we are Americans first, and we will ensure that
This is the wrong one.
Like that. I was like, I'm already mad, but
I think I
it's like we're humans first, weirdly. I also
we are
pick a
humans
lot of
first,
other
yeah.
identifiers of mine before American.
It's supposed to be 2746, not 746. There we go.
Here he is.
Congressman Tim Ryan, Congressman Ryan, your response? So here we are in Detroit, home of the United Auto Workers. We have all our union friends here tonight. This plan that's being offered by Senator Warren and Senator Sanders will tell those union members who gave away wages in order to get good health care that they're going to lose their health care because Washington's going to come in and tell them they got a better plan.
Yeah. So very, very moralizing and very jobby and union-y. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, this is an issue too, when you feel like, and this is, with forgiving, debts and stuff like that, you feel like, well, there are some people who didn't go into debt because they, made the calculation and made their plan, and now you are rewarding the people who made the mistake, that kind of thing. So I think that's kind of where he's coming from in this argument.
Really?
But because he's talking about so to give a little bit of context, he's talking about Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and their Medicare for All plan, which would give everyone health care, right? And you've got these people who worked really hard to join unions and negotiate specific things for themselves. And now it's going to be replaced by this other thing, and now it's like, well, should you're just leaving these people to dry when we used to say, oh, we supported unions, that kind of thing. So that's his objection there. Obviously, I think unions are not optimal for an efficient labor market.
I mean, I think there are good reasons not to give up your health care from your employer that doesn't have to do with union activity.
I think that's right. I think some people have health insurance through their employer that they really like, and that makes sense. And it doesn't make sense to make that illegal, but it can make sense to provide something that competes with that.
Yeah, I agree.
But we talked about this a lot. Like one of the complicated things is it's not just that companies are willingly providing a benefit, and then certain plans make that benefit illegal. It's that companies are currently required to provide health insurance. And one of the things, and maybe you guys know more about this than I do, but I couldn't understand from this debate, like what the proposals on the table had to say about whether companies were required still to provide health insurance or weren't, which seems like the critical thing going on. Because it wouldn't really make sense to me to make it illegal, but I wondered if maybe the Bernie Sanders Elizabeth Warren plan doesn't require companies to provide it anymore, in which case it might not happen anymore. I guess this was the missing link to me to like understanding the two different sides of the policy.
Most countries that have universal health care have, like, even if like the majority of people access it through the government, very few of them like ban them outright.
Right.
Like Australia has some, even the UK, which is like the most probably socialized medicine.
Yeah.
You have some like options, you know,
Right.
like add-ons. Like in Australia, it's like, you know, like cosmetic surgery and stuff
Right.
like that is covered. So I don't know exactly how that works with those plans, but like in the main, it's like I think the bogeyman that's often brought up is this sort of banning of something
Right.
that's like that if I have the money, I want to spend that to get that. I mean, really, even in the most sensible healthcare systems around the world, don't ban it outright.
Right.
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 Yeah.
Then what outright?
Ban additional supplemental.
Private health insurance.
It's just that you provide something that's universal to everybody.
Yeah.
You know, and I think like if you're having, and I think like any, that's why I feel like the basic income has to be tied to. Doesn't have to be, but it would make the most sense in the United States for it to be tied to some kind of Medicare for all type plan, or at least I don't know, of the various versions. I haven't looked into all of them, but something that's effectively universal. Because otherwise, you're gonna have then you have the problem that companies then have to then it makes it a lot harder to have an efficient labor market, like you were saying, because then companies are carrying along.
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
I've heard that like they have like companies want people wanting like a platinum plan or whatever, so they can like
Cadillac, how they call it.
Whatever they can get like cell regeneration or something like that in the future, and like nanites or whatever to repair cells. Or something. And so that the people would have incentive to create these things if there were insurance plans that recover them.
Yeah.
Because at the beginning, those things would be really expensive, and
Right.
as more people access it, the price would come down.
Right.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So our next clip is related to Bethany's point. So we'll do this one.
Mr. Yang, I want to bring you in. You support a Medicare for all system. How do you respond to Governor Inslee?
Well, I just want to share a story. When I told my wife I was running for president, the first question she asked me? What are we going to do about our health care? That's a true story, and it's not just us. Democrats are talking about health care the wrong way. As someone who's run a business, I can tell you flat out our current healthcare system makes it harder to hire. It makes it harder to treat people well and give them benefits and treat them as full-time employees. It makes it harder to switch jobs, as Senator Harris just said, and it's certainly a lot harder to start a business. If we say, look, we're going to get healthcare off the backs of businesses and families, then watch American entrepreneurship recover and bloom. That's the argument we should be making to the American people.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And the other, I think he's the only one who's really emphasizing kind of the amount of kind of market efficiency that universal healthcare would allow.
Yeah.
Because then it's I mean, the fact that we have regulations that says your employer has to give you health insurance.
But only if you have more than 39 hours or something like that.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of bureaucratic, complications
sort of
and that
this
kind of
thing,
thing.
it becomes like the basic, the poverty trap kind of analog for healthcare, like the poverty where you have like a amount, if you earn below a certain amount, then you lose your earn above a certain amount, you lose your benefits. It's the same with an employer with a certain threshold. There's that same kind of like
If they hire more people, they have to offer
exactly.
health
Then
insurance.
all of a sudden they their operating costs might double or something.
Right.
Like overnight.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like it's the same anywhere there's some kind of cliff.
Yeah.
So I think I know Bethany said it's really hard to kind of suss out the details of all their different plans and that kind of thing, and they seem to be kind of arguing about little details, but there are big effects here if you do certain things right, like having a system where you don't have to force employers to provide health insurance, and having a system where you don't force people to get health insurance for their employers. That's kind of like two sides of the coin that would be really I think impactful to our society. Yeah. In much the same way that basic income is income that's not tied to a job. Something like Medicare for all is health insurance that's not tied to a job. And I often bring up like it's a little bit weird that we live in a society where we're expecting private corporations to take care of people. That's the government's job.
It's
right?
very strange. And then everyone's like, but they only care about profits.
Right. I mean, that's what it's supposed to be, right?
That's how they survive.
And I think when you're forcing employers to kind of to do things for their employees, when the government is doing that, they're kind of foisting their own responsibility onto private companies, and that's really inefficient.
It's largely a historical accident as well that it ended up that way, I think, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
It was in like Truman administration. I don't know the details, but I think it was sort of one of these things where they just sort of like every most countries kind of like came up with some sort of version of the universal healthcare. Beverage, yes, that exactly that model, and then the U.S. decided, we're just going to get it because it built on something that existed before, and then it just sort of got stuck like a frozen accident.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
And I think it's related to labor movements and Karl Marx, of course. He was living in a time when the Industrial Revolution was happening, and he was like, wait a minute, workers are supposed to be getting paid, and he really tied that to jobs. And then he said, oh well, they're not getting enough money. So instead of saying, oh well, maybe the labor market isn't the right way to get incomes to people, he said, okay, now the workers are being exploited. And it really, that's kind of, I would say even before that point, but certainly he reinforced this idea that employers need to be taking care of their employees. That mentality, yeah.
But it's still true that many other countries didn't go the direction for health insurance of having countries, like Alex is saying.
That's true. Yes, that's a really good point. Yeah.
The first socialized medical plan was instituted by Bismarck in Germany.
Okay, here we go for another clip.
If you elect me president, you're not electing me to follow. You're electing me to lead. And open borders is a right-wing talking point. And frankly, I'm disappointed that some folks, including some folks on this stage, have taken the bait.
So yeah, I mean, Democrats are saying, of course we don't want open borders. That's really stupid. I can't believe, Republicans are saying that about us. It's a complete mischaracterization, et cetera, et cetera. I would say that we should have open borders, and it makes all of this stuff a lot simpler. All of the immigration stuff, it really kind of you don't have to worry about any of it.
But even you admit that it should be done gradually, so you wouldn't necessarily just flip a switch.
I wouldn't flip a switch on basic income either. I think you don't ever want sudden shocks to the economy, so you'd want to roll out things gradually, implement them gradually, so that people can adapt and all of that. Yeah, I think that's right. Criminal crossings.
Yeah, I mean, open border for everybody?
Well, tell me what you mean by criminal crossings.
Like that caravan thing that Trump's going about.
If the borders are open, it's literally not criminal. So
If the borders are open, it's not criminal to cross.
Right,
so what do you mean by criminal
what
crossing?
I mean is criminals crossing the border. From
Criminals. So I mean, I think if criminals want to come here and be in prison here, that's fine.
I think the idea is that not everybody gets caught.
Yeah, how do we know that they are criminals?
Well, I think we have law enforcement. We have
You don't think there should be checks, like background
specifically at the border, because they're coming from a place that has different enforcement and that kind of thing. I think there could be checks at the border, but I don't think the answer is to send them back. I think the answer is if they're a criminal to send them to prison.
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, and I'd be curious about what. As someone who wants to abolish the carceral state here and everywhere, what kinds of criminal things are we checking, and how thoroughly do we? If we're okay, so I can imagine people being you're a single mother and you killed your abusive husband, and so that's okay. But you're a young man who was in a gang fight, and so it's not okay. But what, you were under the same kind of stress being in a really impoverished area, and you were in a gang, because that was the only way that you could. So you could survive. So
I think there's.
Are we gonna end up with it gets really complicated really fast to be oh, no murderers, but oh, maybe.
So I think that's hold on. I think that's a really good question, and I think there's two issues here. One question is, what should we consider a crime in this country? and how severely should we punish different crimes? And then the other question is, how should we address people coming across the borders who may have, violated whatever we decided on to be our rules and our laws.
To give
and
a
that kind of
concrete
thing.
example, if there's a mass murderer, like serial killer at large,
Yeah.
who crosses the border, there's no reason that we don't arrest that person with, like, even if we have open borders, that person
Right,
could
that's what
still
I'm
be
saying. They're
arrested.
still a criminal because they would
Right.
be a criminal if they were a mass murderer
Here.
too.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Neil.
Actually, no, I lost my point.
Alex.
So you imagining this would be reciprocal, like that other countries should also have the logical end state would there be no borders internationally. You're just talking about the United States.
I'm talking about whatever country is thinking about implementing open borders should do it, regardless of what any other country is doing. But yeah, I would imagine that if other countries see the success of open borders, then they might follow the lead. I don't think it's necessary for all countries to have open borders in order for it to work.
Seems
For
like
one country.
it seems like it could be a kind of collective action problem because you're trying to.
So the question is, how do you get the incentives right? So you don't want immigrants to be draining too many of your country's resources. So then you can use something like basic income. If you set it too high, then maybe too many people come in and maybe it's a drain or something like that. But I have a hunch, and I said this in my post, that at least in the long term, the country with more people is going to be more powerful because people are really a valuable resource. But that doesn't mean that you wouldn't have a problem if you had a really high basic income and let everyone in all at once. So I would say you'd calibrate the basic income to the level of immigration that you're kind of comfortable with coming into your country, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, this will go to a different, so if there was something to your point.
Bethany?
Oh, I'm happy to transition, but I guess just one more point that's sort of to your point, Alex, is like there's two different kinds of benefits in my mind, I guess. There's like international benefits to open borders, which is that like you'd actually have competition on governments, which you don't have now. Like, like mostly because people can't immigrate very easily. So it's like you have internal ways of reforming, but you don't have external competition.
Right.
So if there were somehow obviously
Yeah.
if you're somehow people could leave brutal dictatorships easily, go somewhere else.
Well, I guess I'm
that would be.
I'm not disagreeing with. I mean, it's not an ideal world that you would be, but I wonder about the. I think one of the counter arguments people are going to say is that what does citizenship mean then?
Yeah, right.
Ultimately, because if you had no open borders everywhere, then there's going to be no, and that would be an ultimate good end state. I think.
It sounds ideal.
Because it sounds like a utopia, but it's sort of like, how do you get there from where we are now?
I think that's a great question to be asking. And if you imagine a country that has open borders and is paying a basic income, then you can ask, well, what if we just offered a basic income to everyone in the world and you don't have to come here? You can say, I'm a United States citizen now, but I'm choosing to live where I live. And that could actually be more efficient. It might be more of a drain on the economy to actually have the people come in, and than it would be if a lot of them just decided to stay where they are. So that's I can imagine the progression working like that a little bit, but I agree with your end state that's kind of optimal. Everyone in the world having a basic income and not really having so many divisions between countries and that kind of thing. Go ahead, Neil.
If we're gonna move on, it's just a random.
We're gonna move on.
I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
It's sort of funny when we talk about like, all countries having open borders, universal basic income. I sort of wonder, countries are formed from what they were millennia ago in some cases. How would countries have been formed today if those structures were in place? Because we're sort of putting fixes on a imperfect system. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious, what would an idealized society have been constructed from?
And I think that's a great question. Countries were formed when we didn't have airplanes and cars and stuff like that. It was all people in villages and then maybe on horses and
they wanted to protect their own.
They wanted to protect their scarce resources. They were competing with each other for territory and resources and that kind of thing.
The nation state kind of was sort of like concept was kind of formed somewhere out of the Industrial Revolution.
Treaty of Westphalia in the 1600s.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's pre-industrial revolution. But I mean, the nation state evolved from the city state and the empires and all of that.
I mean, it might have legally came into existence then, but sort of like what I think of as modern nation states really sort of. I mean, they kind of go hand in hand to some degree with the Industrial Revolution. That's in my understanding of history.
I think that's right in terms of like the transition from monarchies to, you know, what we have now. But yeah, it's an interesting question. If a bunch of people were just put on a planet, and then you know, what kinds of governance structures would they form if they had all the technology that we have today? I would imagine that it would look a lot different. Even without basic income, I would imagine that it would look a lot different, and that we might have kind of more of a global society that would go along with the global economy that we already have.
I think it's really hard to imagine like a beginning state here, though. Not to go too far off on this tangent, but like in a way, it's really hard for people to find ways to cooperate. And so like you can also read history as like bigger and bigger spheres of cooperation. Like nation states are limited, but they're a lot bigger than individual groups that live right next to each other and are at war all the time. And in many ways, that expansion
But we're sort of seeing the
continues to
limits
happen.
of, like, even just with politics today in the United States, the limits of how much cooperation you need before you start getting some serious internal dissension. So how do you manage that on a global?
Well, I mean, governance, it has to be hierarchical at some level. So when we talk about cooperation, that can include hierarchies, you know, so that, you know, things are managed and negotiated, you know, people are represented instead of everyone kind of like
so when
going
I
off
say
on their own and
cooperation,
that
I
kind of thing.
include like brutal dictator. Because he gets, I mean, it's not necessarily good for everybody, but he gets everybody in an alliance against, say, some other country, and like serving a broader sort of economic thing and so on. So I use it in a funny way. I should have said that. It's not necessarily like positive or negative, but yeah.
Religions have also historically played a pretty big role in this as well, and have been very tied to the empires and all of that. Elizabeth, did you have a
I was
question?
going to say that, like, I mean, thinking about sort of like beginning stages or different ways that things could have developed, that like a lot of like indigenous peoples have a much more sort of like, okay, like you have this tribe and then maybe you're warring with some other tribes, but you're like cooperating with a lot of other ones because like you're trading. And then like we get a lot of Western colonialism. It's like, okay, we're gonna like sort of imposing nation state kind of idea. So like, so if you wanted to think about how could you it have developed differently, like you could use like a non-Western model to think about, like, okay, if we had like these other ways of thinking that weren't like, okay, like we have to have these very specific like boundaries, and we all own some land and we own some people, and like, I mean, not that indigenous people didn't fuck some things up, but like Western colonialism fucked up a lot more.
Okay, here we go. Here's another one.
Your response.
I'm the son of immigrants myself. My father immigrated here as a graduate student and generated over 65 US patents for GE and IBM. I think that's a pretty good deal for the United States. That's the immigration story we need to be telling. We can't always be focusing on some of the distressed stories. And if you go to a factory here in Michigan, you will not find wall-to-wall immigrants. You will find wall-to-wall robots and machines. Immigrants are being scapegoated for issues they have nothing to do with in our economy.
So, I mean, I think the last point that he made is really good. That immigrants are kind of being scapegoated for random stuff. You know, people are struggling in America, and they want someone to blame. Yeah, I saw that. The YouTube comments. I don't think we need to get into them. But yeah, I mean, well, I guess this is related. So Michael said Americans per capita have higher crime rate than legal and illegal immigrants.
Right.
So
because we were talking about that.
Yeah, because people are worried about criminals coming in, that kind of thing. Well, there's more criminals here, all of that. And I think that's right, that we are scapegoating immigrants. And, you know, we saw a lot of that, especially, you know, with the rise of Donald Trump and that kind of stuff. But people are having problems, and they want to blame someone for those problems. And Andrew Yang is kind of doing the same thing that Donald Trump did, except he's doing it with robots instead of people, which is a little less harmful. But really, it's not the robot's fault either. It's the fault of the fact that we don't have basic income. So I'm not a fan of his story about his father coming in as an immigrant and doing the patents and stuff. Not just because I'm anti-patent, which I am, but also because that is a different kind of immigrant. That's not an immigrant who's coming here because they're desperate. And there are immigrants who come here because they're desperate. And those are the immigrants that we're scapegoating. We're not scapegoating Andrew Yang's father. Like, that's not what we're doing.
Although, as a small side point, it also is hard for a lot of highly educated people to come and immigrate here as well. So it's not like it's super easy on either side.
It's a problem, and we should certainly make that easier too.
It's usually bureaucratic and long and time-consuming.
Yeah, you
and
can speak to this
expensive.
better than me.
People that who say that don't have any. To do it legally, it's it takes time and money.
Yeah. So, sorry that happened to you.
No, I'm fine. I did at one point get a letter from USCIS saying you got 30 years in the country because I made a mistake on a form.
Oh, wow.
I basically didn't check a certain box and the thing didn't go to the right person. So, but I'm still here.
Go ahead, Noel.
Yeah, this whole idea of otherism really inspires people because we want to be. We don't just want to be better than we are. A lot of people want to be better than the other guys.
Right.
The grass is always greener on this side. And so that's just like a really sad aspect of American ideals as well.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think there's always going to be some of that, right? There's always going to be some kind of people identify with either their family or their country or themselves. They just want to be better than other people, that kind of thing. And there's always going to be ways that the people who really feel strongly about that are going to be able to distinguish themselves. So I don't think it's that problematic. I think it's part of human nature, and we can have a healthy, successful society. We can have a competitive environment, or just people being jerks to each other a little bit is not necessarily a problem in the grand scheme of things, as long as our governance and our overall society is treating people well and giving people the freedom to make the most of their lives.
As long as we're going to recognize is that humans have cooperative and competitive instincts simultaneously, not like this sort of, everything in our criminal justice system to everything tends to kind of basically assume you've got to be made to be a good person because by default you're going to be a bad person.
Right.
And that's not really actually how human beings are.
No, human beings are not good or bad. They're just people, and we want to incentivize them, so we came up with morality to judge them. Yeah. So here's the next one.
Everybody's attention.
Thank you, Senator.
Time for action.
Senator Gillibrand, what's your response? Will finding company?
That's not right. Oh, I went to the end time instead of the beginning time. Here we go. I wish there was a way to just have them all queued up like I do on the YouTube tabs.
Right. You could cut them all quickly.
Since 1963, when we passed the Equal Pay Act, we have been talking about the fact women are not paid equally for equal work. Fast forward to the year of our Lord 2019, and women are paid 80 cents on the dollar, Black women 61 cents, Native American women 58 cents, Latinas 53 cents. I'm done with the conversation. So yes, I am proposing, in order to deal with this, one, I'm going to require corporations to post on their website whether they are paying women equally for equal work. Two, they will be fined for every 1% differential between what they are paying men and women. They will be fined 1% of their previous year's profits. That'll get everybody's attention.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bethany.
So there's a lot that I don't know about this. For example, I don't really know, just as a caveat, and I would like to know more, what does the 80 cents on the dollar mean? Is that just incomes across men and women? Maybe you know that. That would help me to start off my comment.
It's actually about how women take time off to raise children, so their incomes don't rise at the same rate as men's do, even if they do have the same position.
Okay. So I think Richard is saying yes, that it is incomes just across.
So one thing
people.
I really like that she proposed, if I interpret it correctly, is to post. Transparent information about salaries is generally, so far as I understand from The Economist and so on, a really useful thing to have because people have more information. They can negotiate better for their own salary. That kind of thing seems really, really good. Something that I find a little more tricky is her idea of fining for not paying equal for equal work, because that's part of why I asked my original question. It implies, first of all, that you literally have the same person in the same job and you're paying them differently, but I don't know that that's actually what the data suggests. And also it provides some perverse incentives, like we talked about with banning the box. I'd be worried about, it's a huge disincentive to hire women. It's a huge incentive to kind of find loopholes, and I can't imagine you could ever make this all that tight in terms of what it means to pay equal for equal work. And so then what kinds of other weird things are companies doing to not maybe hire women into the position that she would have been hired into before, so that she's not getting paid less.
Richard was saying, these arguments have been on since the 70s about equal pay what is equal work?
Right, exactly.
What other jobs are they exactly
What is
alike?
equal pay?
Are they on
And-
the same
And that's not to
time
say,
scale?
and you know, there are many examples. That's not to say that like really people aren't sometimes paid the same for same or better quality work, but you have to know kind of what's going on.
Yeah, what is, you know,
I'm gonna call
different
on Neil
people
'cause he's raising his hand.
perform differently in the
Right.
same job.
Right.
Yeah, Neil.
I think an important part that I think you just mentioned, Bethany, was like I don't know if this is also like a false statistic, but I was reading how like I guess as a society, I don't know if it's as Americans or just globally, like the fact that we don't talk about our salaries,
Right.
and that's just like an undue disadvantage
Right.
the entire labor market, like laborers put on themselves.
Yeah.
Because it reduces, well, bargaining power.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it could also be a manifestation that I don't want to like blame anyone, but like it's like there are people like studies who say like the males like negotiate for higher rates,
Right.
and like men feel more brazen to be able to do that,
Right.
and the fact that women that we don't discuss our salaries, so they don't know what other people are making.
Right.
Yeah.
And I
that's
think
the
that would make a
employer's
huge difference.
advantage that people don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because not so they can cheat people, but so they can make their own kind of evaluations of people's performances without criticism. And
Yeah.
they can make their own judgments, and they feel they have the right to. They run
Yeah.
the business.
So I think
But
in-
I wanted to say one more thing.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the equal pay for equal work, there are jobs, and I've told you this, Alex, when I was a tech writer, when I was an editor, the women were all editors. When I became a writer, where the men were, then it was something like $4,000 more a year just because of the job. And then tech writing became a pink collar industry because so many women went into it. Then the wages stayed stagnant.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's more than just equal pay for equal work.
Right.
There are a lot of factors that work in terms of
Yeah.
gender and discrimination in
So
the workplace.
I think it's always going to be true that employers are going to want to pay the least amount of money possible for whatever employees they hire. And I think, you know, what Bethany said is probably the most important thing. If we want people to be paid more, is have more disclosure of how much people are paid, more information about that. But we could also ask whether that's a good thing. Because in a world with basic income, you're not necessarily expecting people to earn their living through their job or to get the bulk of their income through their job. So then is it a problem that employers are only paying the bare minimum necessary to incentivize the labor? I don't know that it's necessarily a problem. A lot of these things, you know, when we talk about fairness in the workplace, they start to look maybe less concerning when we're not so dependent on the workplace in our lives.
I mean, I agree, but I think it's also a question we've raised in here a lot, which is kind of like independent of maybe having like most of your income come from somewhere else. Do we still care about different kinds of power imbalances as defined by groups? And I think that's like an interesting open question. Some people still care a lot about that kind of power imbalance, and some people don't care maybe anymore if people are basically doing okay. But you know, you could still care whether really prestigious positions are generally not held by women.
So so then there's a question of do we care, and then there's a question of should we care, and then there's a question of because a lot of people care, does that mean we should care too? You know, that kind of stuff. And you know, I think these are all interesting questions. Yeah, and I think no matter what society you're living in, there's going to be examples of injustice and unfairness that we want to remedy, that we don't want to be there. So I think there's still going to be some of that in the workplace that we want to fix, even in a world with basic income. I'm not sold on the idea that having salaries and wages being fully disclosed is ultimately what's best for the consumer. Because if we're thinking about people as consumers rather than as workers, you know, what's the most efficient way to incentivize the right amount of labor for the stuff being produced? I'm not sure. It probably actually doesn't matter. It could probably go either way, in which case, if people feel good about that stuff being revealed, then maybe it's worth doing, if it makes people feel like things are more fair. Yeah.
And that's the thing for me is, so my coworker was very wanting to know what I make, basically. And I didn't feel comfortable because I feel like, well, if I make less, I'll be resentful. If I make more, you know, she might get resentful. I think it would create maybe a hostile work environment.
Yeah.
We would have more bargaining power, but I think it would be difficult to to work knowing that someone who's in the same job as I, in the same role, doing basically the same work, is making a different amount.
I think that's right, and I think that's a big part of the reason why, if we are going to do something like this, it shouldn't be on the employees to share it with each other. It should be on the employer. And now that the employer is sharing everyone's salary information, they don't want you and your coworker to be having these kinds of problems.
Right.
So they're more likely to pay you similar amounts if you're doing similar kind of work, that kind of thing. So you wouldn't have to worry about it. Yeah.
And many sort of industry, like in academia, especially in public universities, that stuff's public information.
Right.
Yeah.
Salaries, professors.
Yeah.
You could argue that's a good thing about it, but
it can be inefficient too, I guess. Like if you have that kind of situation, then maybe they're not able to pay a bit more for someone that either is more reluctant to come, or that they really think would be great, or because so many things are intangible. Like Joan said, like what is equal work?
Right.
I mean, it's.
So I think your answer is the best answer. Just public disclosure of the wages, and then it can kind of sort itself out.
Yeah, but I think Ian's point and your point combined challenge what I said, which is that there might then be an incentive to even out the wages that would be too much for what's efficient.
Yes.
So people don't get into
that's
conflicts
a possible
or,
concern.
Yeah.
But I wonder if then there would also be some sort of culture shift around, like if we're in a place where we're actually disclosing wages, that then employers are more able to say, like, okay, we we sometimes choose to pay more for reasons X, Y, Z. Like not necessarily saying like we paid Sally more for this one specific reason, to be like, we will often, if people have more experience in a particular thing or like whatever,
explain it more.
Because then it's not like they're on the defensive from a black box kind of perspective of like, well, I found out that Sally makes more than me, and like, why is that? And then like, well, now we have to litigate the specific issue of Sally.
Exactly.
Instead, it's like, well, okay, everyone knows how much everyone makes, and we can be forthcoming about like, here are some of the different things that we take into consideration.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
And so it feels less like, oh, I got cheated. Like, did Sally know to negotiate more? Like, is it that she's like somehow like secretly like knows someone? Like what is happening because you don't know why?
But there are some intangibles too among people in between. Not everybody does a job equally well, and they can't necessarily be trained to do it as well as somebody else who's just better at it.
Well, I think this is why the disclosure of information can work out those intangibles, right? So people can.
Those are tangible. Also.
What?
When you say someone's doing something better, then there's certain tangible things that they're doing better.
Right. It's how well can you measure this thing,
and it's hard to tell when you're being hired.
Right.
Like the point at which you typically get hired, they can't evaluate you on those things, except for maybe like references and stuff like that.
Experience and checklists and stuff. But then when they see you on the job, it might change.
And then oftentimes it's like once you've got that salary, you're already. Like if you start here, you can only, this person moves up and that kind of
which is part of why the pay gap.
Yeah,
and then negotiate more, and so they're just everyone progresses.
They start,
It's also possible like your salary is based on what you said your previous salaries were, and that could have been arbitrary in a sense.
Just
right.
You get various disparities for.
So Mitchell on the live stream says, what if you only have 3 employees? How could you post if you're paying equal pay when the jobs may be different, and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
So I think that's exactly right. You can't really tell what equal work is. And this next clip will also relate to this.
I know there's no clock. What does it say?
I know. This is timeless. It's actually 3 a.m. right now.
Yeah. He's
Mr. Yang, women on average earn 80 cents, about 80 cents for every dollar earned by men.
Oh, I see.
Senator Harris wants to fine companies that don't close their gender pay gaps. As an entrepreneur, do you think a stiff fine will change how companies pay their female employees?
I have seen firsthand the inequities in the business world where women are concerned, particularly in startups and entrepreneurship. We have to do more at every step. And if you're a woman entrepreneur, the obstacles start not just at home, but then when you seek a mentor or an investor, often they don't look like you, and they might not think your idea is the right one. In order to give women a leg up, what we have to do is we have to think about women in every situation, including the ones who are in exploitative and abusive jobs and relationships around the country. I'm talking about the waitress who's getting harassed by her boss at the diner, who might have a business idea, but right now is stuck where she is. What we have to do is we have to give women the economic freedom to be able to improve their own situations and start businesses. And the best way to do this is by putting a dividend of $1,000 a month into their hands. It would be a game changer for women around the country because we know that women do more of the unrecognized and uncompensated work in our society. It will not change unless we change it. And I say that's just what we do.
So I liked a lot of what he said until the very end.
Serious there at the end.
That's what we do.
That's just what we do. Yeah. You know, I think, you know, there's more to this than just jobs. And if people are tied to a job for their income, that takes away a lot of their freedom. And money gives a lot of freedom, and that's going to be true regardless of your situation. And kind of like I said before, I mean, the labor market is a market for getting people to do things. So the fact that there's women who are staying home and doing important work and not getting paid for it, that's not a problem. So I don't. It's not a problem for anyone.
Just kidding.
I mean, I'm staying home and not getting paid for it, so I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, but I'm doing, you know, what I want to do with my time. But yeah, I mean,
he's not getting recognized.
Yeah, and you know, it kind of it implies, by the fact that he says that it's not getting recognized, he implies that money is the only way to recognize someone and that kind of thing. And I don't think that's kind of like the way we want to frame things either.
Yeah. Not to mention that a basic income technically doesn't change that disparity on a purely dollar per dollar ground.
It doesn't. The basic income isn't paying someone to stay home and it's paying someone to give them money because they're a person, and then they're still choosing to do whatever they do. Yeah.
But what I do think is right, and I like, is that, you know, it does really help with a lot of issues that affect many people but may disproportionately affect women.
Yes.
And then people might be worried about that, like the concern about being in an abusive relationship or not being able to get out of that, or an abusive job with sexual harassment or something like that.
It helps anyone who has a disproportional lack of freedom due to lack of money.
Right, which is many vulnerable groups people are concerned about have that.
Exactly. Yeah, Neil.
Well, I would say that in a lot of, well, like, I understand the extreme wincing when he ties it so hardly to the labor market, but I think there's also something to be said that like bearing children is like a financial burden. So can't you sort of make a link to like maternal care and like needing a basic income?
So the question is, why does someone deserve to be paid? And the answer is the incentives. So if someone is having a child without being paid and they're just doing that, then the question is, are enough people having children? If not enough people are having children, then we can start paying people to have children. If too many people are having children, then we can start taxing people for having children, right? It's a matter of...
it's just out of that sphere, so to say. It's like not...
Yeah, I mean, like, we can kind of come up with moral arguments for just about anything.
Right.
But the question is, what outcomes do we want?
I mean, that also gets the idea that at some point, when you say we, it means society as a whole, right? That's what you mean.
Yeah.
But that itself is then affected by relative power amongst groups. And obviously basic income can help that, but you're still going to have, even with basic income, you're still going to have these relative disparities between the groups that are controlling, you know, say, let's go back to the example of, you know, like we always talk about, you know, work needs to be done, you know, like we value certain kinds of work, you know, and we don't value other kinds of work. That still doesn't, like, basic income in and of itself doesn't change that.
We don't want to change that, right? Because the reason we value different kinds of work has to do with the incentives to get people to do the work.
Well, he might be saying that we actually want to have like more interest in certain kinds of work happening, like pro-environmental changes, for example.
So I think
don't know if that's what you're saying.
Environmental changes,
right.
Education, you know, like, you know, early education, you know, things that are generally now like are very lowly paid, you know, social work, things like that. We don't, you know, and in order to make those pay more, at some level, society has to choose. And when Vice is saying society has to choose, what you really mean is like, how do you get people who don't have power, more power, to influence that? And the basic income can help that in the long term, I feel, because you can then, because now maybe we can be a bit more rational about how we plan things, you know, and like have time to think about it. But in and of itself, you're still going to have politics and, arguments about what's important and what's not important to different
Right.
groups of people. You know what I'm saying?
So I think that's right, and I think there are some resources that are not best allocated by the markets, and there are some incentives that we want that the markets are not going to generate.
Right.
So
Might be a market failure in lots of healthcare, as an example.
I wouldn't even say market failure. I would say that it's a failure of us to expect the markets to allocate these resources efficiently. Yeah.
And there's some kind of
I guess it's kind of a semantic difference, but the term market failure implies that you're expecting the market to do something and it kind of failed at doing that, which I think is maybe not the right framing. But there is a debate to be had in terms of what resources are best allocated by the government and what kind of work is best incentivized by the government, and then what kinds of things are best allocated by the market. And there's plenty of debate about that. But for the things that are best allocated by the market, that's what basic income is for. So maybe the market doesn't incentivize enough childcare. So that means maybe the government should subsidize childcare. So that is one thing. Then I also want to get back to a point we had before, which is in terms of like rewarding different kinds of work. And I think it's fine to reward different kinds of work because it's just about the incentives. But then there's the question of people, right? Do we want to make sure, we probably want to make sure that the economy is benefiting everyone, right? So if there's something about women that makes it harder to receive the benefit, then maybe it makes sense to pay women more or something like that, or give them a higher basic income, or do something to kind of compensate for the burden that they bear if we care about each person equally or something like that. So I think that's a reasonable thing to bring up. But basic income on its own doesn't solve that. It just gives everyone money equally, women and non-women alike. Those non-women people, yeah, whoever they are, yeah.
It doesn't solve it. Like I think we said this before, but it doesn't solve every possible problem.
Right.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of problems more easily.
It solves the problems that are solved by the market because it funds the market and allows the market to be efficient. Did you have a thought, Bethany?
No, we can move on.
All right.
I'd like to get to the next clip.
Here we go. We got the next clip here.
I would move to de-escalate tensions in Iran because they're responding to the fact that we pulled out of this agreement. And it wasn't just us and Iran, there were many other world powers that were part of that multilateral agreement. We'd have to try and re-enter that agreement, renegotiate the timelines because the timelines now don't make as much sense. But I've signed a pledge to end the forever wars. Right now, our strength abroad reflects our strength at home. What's happened, really? We've fallen apart at home, so we elected Donald Trump. And now we have this erratic and unpredictable relationship with even our long-standing partners and allies. What we have to do is we have to start investing those resources to solve the problems right here at home. We've spent trillions of dollars and lost thousands of American lives in conflicts that had unclear benefits. We've been in a constant state of war for 18 years. This is not what the American people want. I would bring the troops home, I would de-escalate tensions with Iran, and I would start investing our resources in our own communities.
Yeah. So the reason I chose this quote, or this clip, is because it relates, well, I like that he's relating basic income to the military. And the reason I like that is because in a lot of ways, the military is a jobs program.
I don't know how he's relating it to the military.
Well, he was talking about, wars that we're fighting, and bringing people home and investing the resources. So he's talking about basic income. When he talks about giving the resources to the people at home, he's talking about, right.
For wars, okay.
Right, and he's emphasizing that if he didn't say basic income here, but I think what he's talking about is that if we give people a basic income, then maybe there'll be less incentive to spend resources on, keeping everyone occupied with war, that kind of thing. And I think that's right. Maybe I'm reading into it a little bit too much, but it is a point that I wanted to make that, we waste a ton of resources during war, but it gets everyone employed, and it gets the economy going really well, assuming it's not your infrastructure that's being bombed, that kind of thing. But like what World War II did for the United States could have been achieved with a basic income, right? But we never would have just printed money and started handing it to people without the excuse of a war. And with the war, we're wasting a ton of resources, not just people's time, but like all the materials and everything that's going into we're just building stuff to be blown up. that kind of stuff. And obviously there's
Yeah.
deaths, which are bad.
It's
There's that.
Yeah.
It's a really good sign that you're leaving a solution on the table when you're able to activate your economy more when you're wasting more resources. Like, I guess to put it another way,
Right.
you're not at productive capacity. Because if you
Yes.
were already at productive capacity, you wouldn't be doing better and able to pay people more and have more money going to people that turns into real resources
Yeah.
while you're blowing things up and like using more labor for war and all
It's
this
good
kind
for the
of thing.
military contractors.
Right. But I guess I'm
Yeah.
thinking,
They
so
make out like bandits.
I should have put out what was in my head out on the table too, which is I'm thinking especially of like World War II following the Depression, where like if we hadn't had the resources to produce more during the Depression, and that's why we had a depression, then we never could have scaled things up for war when we're now wasting more of those resources at war. But it just shows what Alex often talks about, which is the problem is that the demand isn't there. And then you, in war times, you actually, and I've taken now most of this money in banking class that he's so into, like they relax the finances so that you're allowed to basically just like print more money during the war. And and we go off the gold standard if we're on it and that kind of thing. And so then you create the demand. And it shows that there was kind of capacity to meet that demand, that can actually be good for the economy instead of everybody going with less food because you're at war or something like that.
Yeah.
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 So it's
So it's something to think about. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why we'd have less war and potentially less military with a basic income. One is that people wouldn't be as desperate, wouldn't be as struggling. But then another one is this thing that, we, at least to some degree, we use the military to activate the economy. And that is tragic. It's just bad. Yeah. Unnecessary. So here's another one.
Mr. Yang, why are you the best candidate to heal the racial divide in America? Your response.
I spent 7 years running a nonprofit that helped create thousands of jobs, including hundreds right here in Detroit, as well as Baltimore, Cleveland, New Orleans. And I saw that the racial disparities are much, much worse than I'd ever imagined. They're even worse still. A study just came out that projected the average African-American median net worth will be 0 by 2053. So you have to ask yourself, how is that possible? It's possible because we're in the midst of the greatest economic transformation in our history. Artificial intelligence is coming. It's going to displace hundreds of thousands of call center workers, truck drivers, the most common job in 29 states, including this one. And you know who suffers most in a natural disaster? It's people of color, people who have lower
That's what he should have said for climate change, by the way. And I'll just keep going.
levels of capital and education and resources. So what are we going to do about it? We should just go back to the writings of Martin Luther King, who in 1967, his book Chaos or Community, said we need a guaranteed minimum income in the United States of America. That is the most effective way for us to address racial inequality in a genuine way and give every American a chance in the 21st century economy.
So I don't like that he's, name dropping Martin Luther King here. I don't think Martin Luther King was for basic income, and when he said a guaranteed income, I think he was probably imagining that it would come from jobs, that it would be some kind of jobs program, something like that. So that bothers me a little bit.
Most people don't.
Most people don't know that.
They'll be like, oh, Martin Luther King.
Right, yeah.
I mean, which is why it's always a cheap shot to like.
It's always
Well, it works.
always a cheap shot. Yeah.
I think he did say something along those lines, but maybe he just never was specific to know whether or not that's actually what he meant. I don't know.
I think it's not clear that he was referring to what we think of as basic income. He wanted some kind of system in place to ensure that people had a guaranteed income, but it wasn't, and guaranteed income it could just be like, okay, make sure that poor people have topped them off, that kind of thing.
From what little tiny bit I do know.
Same spirit of thing.
Yeah, from the little bit that I know, I agree with you, but there was a general idea that's a similar insight to what we talk about a lot here, or idea, which is that like poverty was a really big factor in the racial concerns, and
Yes.
without addressing that, I mean, it's not controversial, but without addressing that in a direct way, you were going to be in trouble.
I think that's right, and I really like most of what Yang says here, because I really do think this is a big part of the solution, and it's not only our marginalized groups and minorities going to have more resources because they have more money, but it's also going to be the case that everyone else does too, and it's possible that there could be less of this scarcity that's fueling the tribalism, racism, xenophobia in our country. And that's not to say that these things aren't self-reinforcing, and people's minds are going to change immediately. But right now in our country, we have active things that are happening to people that are making them, you know, circle the wagons with their in-group and blame out-groups, and that only fuels racism, anti-immigration, all of that stuff. Yeah. So we're here at the end. I guess let's watch Andrew Yang's closing statement, and then call it a night. I think.
Where are all those clips?
Oh, we've also not. Oh no, this is it. Yeah. So we will have made it through all of the Andrew Yang clips. So let's see.
You know, since you're new, we never get through all the quotes or clips that Alex has. It's kind of a running joke.
Oh, there's a lot of clips we didn't get to, but I wanted to make sure you guys
Clips.
got your fill of Yang.
These are us.
Yeah, here we go.
You know what the talking heads couldn't stop talking about after the last debate? It's not the fact that I'm somehow number 4 on the stage in national polling. It was the fact that I wasn't wearing a tie. Instead of talking about automation in our future, including the fact that we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs, hundreds of thousands right here in Michigan, we're up here with makeup on our faces and our rehearsed attack lines, playing roles in this reality TV show. It's one reason why we elected a reality TV star as our president. We need to be laser focused on solving the real challenges of today, like the fact that the most common jobs in America may not exist in a decade, or that most Americans cannot pay their bills. My flagship proposal, the Freedom Dividend, would put $1,000 a month into the hands of every American adult, be a game changer for millions of American families. If you care more about your family and your kids than my neckwear, enter your zip code at yang2020.com and see what $1,000 a month would mean to your community. I have done the math. It's not left. It's not right. It's forward. And that is how we're going to beat Donald Trump in 2020.
Okay, so that's it. Thanks for the discussion, guys. I hope it was fun. And for those of you who didn't slog through the whole debates, I hope you enjoyed the highlights here.
Thank you for edit. Yeah, I didn't see any of the first debate. I saw half of the second. So
yeah,
You missed out on. No, never mind.
So
wait till the live stream is done.
So next week we are going to be talking about the free rider problem. So the concern is that well, if you just give everyone money, are they just going to sit around?
That.
And this is you know, a concern that's often brought up with basic income, and we're going to get into it next week. Yeah. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, people on the live stream. Yeah.
nice to meet you.